Hi everyone, and welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is September 19th, 2017. The North Korean leader launched another missile last week, just after the UN Security Council voted for sanctions. I'm joined today by my guest, Lance Gatling. Lance is a 30-year member of the Tokyo community. He's well known throughout business, the defense and aerospace industries here in Japan. Lance, thank you very much for joining me.
Nice to be here, Tim. Thanks.
On a technical level, how safe is Tokyo? How safe can people be with all of this stuff that's flying over the archipelago?
The technical risk to Tokyo is engendered by a number of things. There are different elements that someone would try to put together into a system that would damage Tokyo. If they had the political will to attack Tokyo directly, the question then becomes whether they have the technical capability of doing something about it. Building, assembling, operating, launching, correctly guiding, and fusing a weapon of any sort on a ballistic missile is very, very difficult. Nuclear weapons in particular are very, very complex. The miniaturization of a nuclear weapon is a very complex issue. The reliable fusing of that weapon is very, very complex. It also doesn't mean that a nuclear weapon would necessarily destroy all of Tokyo. They have limited power. I once did a calculation that I could sit in my office in Aoyama, and if the palace was hit by a direct attack with a nuclear weapon, that I would probably be pretty safe because there's intervening high ground. Now, if you're in Kasumigaseki or the Diet Building, you certainly have a big problem. But we are masked by intervening terrain, high ground ridges that would deflect the blast away. So it's a very, very complex question. And number one of it is, of course, do they have the political will to actually do that? The danger is, of course, that nuclear weapons raise the risk of damage to people on the receiving end, also the perceived risk by those people, even though it would not necessarily mean the end of Tokyo. It would certainly mean the end for a very large number of people. And then the question becomes, would they have the accuracy to put it where they want to put it? And would it have the effect that they want? Because they can't follow this up with a tremendous number of follow-on missiles. The United States openly admits to having thousands and thousands of warheads that can be very precisely delivered, that are incredibly accurate and incredibly reliable. So they risk total destruction of the North Korean regime by doing so. Once again, the question is, does the political will exist? And is that political will to be exercised? I, for one, don't think so. It's not my particular area of expertise, but I'm still here, which I understand is of some comfort to the cameraman and other folks, that's not something that's going to happen very quickly. But very soon, rather. It would happen very quickly. It would happen within minutes of a launch.
6 minutes?
The time is really, it depends on the trajectory, whether it's a high, low, medium, or efficient trajectory.
But they can hit Tokyo on a single-stage rocket, right?
Using a single-stage rocket, it turns out that the distance from most places, logical launch points in North Korea, are within 1,200 kilometers, less than 1,200 kilometers to Tokyo. And it turns out that the physics with the current classes of engines that they have available is that the outer limits for a single-stage rocket is around 1,200 kilometers with a useful payload. It has to get there reliably. And a single-stage rocket is much, much simpler than a multi-stage rocket, both in terms of the total size, the number of events that have to happen for the rocket to reach its target. And that is what's so destabilizing about the notion that the North Koreans might be able to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and put it on a single-stage rocket that could reach major population and centers in Japan. That's what gives everyone fits.
Right. And the accuracy of a single-stage rocket is enhanced the shorter it is from launch, or is that really not much of a consideration?
The difficulty of having an accurate rocket is compounded the farther you go away. Okay. It's not a simple linear relationship. It is compounded. It goes up substantially, particularly when you start firing multiple stages. You're going a longer distance. You're dealing with more energy. You're dealing with higher velocities. You're dealing with more energy on entry, which creates heat, which creates problems for the electronics. So yes, by any means, a short battlefield rocket that had the same basic inertial guidance capability as a much more complex rocket would be very, very accurate for a short range.
I see.
So all things being equal, that's true to a certain degree. One of the more interesting technical developments that the North Koreans have been able to do recently, I understand, is that they are retrofitting some of the old 1950s, literally 1950s, 1960s, early 70s technology, single-stage Scud missiles and the derivatives that the North Koreans have developed. They're actually updating the inertial guidance systems to make them much more useful in a conventional battle against South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same basic technology. It's just a question of how long it has to operate, how accurately it has to operate. So if I have a rocket that's going, say, 10 miles, I have a ballistic missile that's going, call it 20 kilometers. If I'm off by 2 degrees, it's only a short error at 20 kilometers. If I make that 2,000 kilometers, all of a sudden that error may mean that the warhead's not even effective against the intended target.
Isn't it actually more accurate to speculate that the North Koreans are just practicing? They're honing their skills. They're trying to figure out how to guide the missiles. I mean, they're not even, they don't have serious payloads on them yet.
Well, certainly these are test flights. Every flight is a test flight. A country with the limited resources like North Korea has is not going to simply launch. They might launch some older rockets without test equipment, but I would expect that the recent launches have been as heavily instrumented as they could be given North Korea's technical and budgetary restraints. If you think about it, in many ways, it's quite admirable in the sense that they've been able to accomplish something very technical with limited access to the world market, with some people helping them and trying to indigenize, trying to make as much of the equipment as possible locally, I would expect, but also working against sanctions, working against time, working against economic restraints. And world embargoes on almost everything that they would need. If you look at the entire list of equipment they would need, it ranges from aluminum alloys to synthetic fibers to winding machines, filament machines, mandrels, chemicals, exotic chemicals, rocket propellants, things that they simply don't make on their own. If they do, they'd have to import entire factories in order to get the precursor chemicals, to get the complex chemical processes to make this stuff. Because you just don't go down to the hardware and buy hypogolic bipropellant for a rocket. This stuff is incredibly caustic. It's very dangerous to humans, and it also tends to, what we say, interact energetically when they touch. They blow up. The fuel blows up. It doesn't need an igniter. It just touches, it blows up. So all of these things mean that, particularly for these advanced tests, they are as heavily instrumented to provide data back to the North Koreans as possible. So then the question becomes, how are they getting that data back? Typically, for the Russians, the United States, someone like that's firing a long-range missile, they would fire it into the ocean and have a research vessel, euphemistically named research vessel. For the Russians, it was often disguised as a trawler that's receiving this data from various transponders. So the data is probably encrypted. There's a code, so it can't be readily read, but there are people who exist, their professional lives exist to decrypt that data and try to figure out what that means. So these have not been disclosed by friendly governments, but I would anticipate that there would be a North Korean trawler somewhere in the area. To the extent that they could, they would follow it using a ground radar that would a satellite-type dish, a large antenna that would follow the missile and receive the telemetry signal. It's a radio signal of some frequency. And as much as possible, do that from the ground. And then
that would be the North Koreans watching their own.
That would be the North Koreans. But also I would anticipate, it'd be a logical anticipation that the United States, Japan, even Russian and Chinese would want to monitor the missile launch and its telemetry to understand what the missile is capable of. Certainly, they would want to know the terminal phase. What happens in the terminal phase? Is there a projectile? Is there a terminal vehicle that separates from the rocket? Is there a capsule that comes off? What size is that capsule? How does it act? Is it just following a ballistic trajectory, or is it somehow guided? And try to estimate from that the total payload capacity. The payload being, of course, what you want to deliver. In this case, is it 500 kilos or is it 1,200 kilos, which is thought to be the limit of some of these missiles. If you think about a missile delivering 1,200 kilos, the North Koreans have advanced MiG fighters that have a payload of 4,000 or 5,000 kilos. And they can be used time and time again to the extent that you can maintain them. So they could send it on a trip, come back, reload, and go. So all the effort to develop and field these missiles and have them operational is to actually send a pretty small amount of payload somewhere else on the planet. But the original anticipation when these devices were built, it was there was no way to intercept them. Once they were aloft, they would follow a ballistic trajectory, and unless there's something went wrong with the main engine, the second stage engines, the separation or the guidance somehow, that they could not be interfered with. Of course,
they're just going too fast.
They're going too fast. They're going too far, too high, too far, too fast. But the development by the United States and later by Soviet, now Russian equipment, aerospace and defense firms that have developed anti-missile missiles that could literally hit a bullet in flight with a bullet. That's a tremendous step forward, and it changes the game quite dramatically. So for the political calculus, you'd have to ask the North Koreans or someone who follows it much more closely than I. From a technical side, the issue is always trying to make your opponent understand that there is a risk no matter what they do, no matter how much they test, no matter how convinced they are of their own ability to perform the task being successfully fuel, launch, separate, re-enter, and explode a device at the intended target with a great deal of accuracy, that of a sudden you have taken that certainty away and you now insert the notion that they can in fact be stopped in flight. Of course, there are discussions in the United States, and there's some in the common vernacular of left of launch, and people often make a mistake in understanding what the term left of an event is. It's a timeline. From your stance, you're going from time zero to the time of an event. So left of launch is, let's say it takes the North Koreans 3 days to assemble this multi-stage rocket on an outdoor platform, and it takes to fuel it, to make sure everything works, and there's a time zero, they start assembling it up to 3 days, and then there's a launch, and then it only takes a few minutes to get to a target. The left of launch is the idea that you intercept before that. You either destroy the missile on the launch platform, or even before that, before you've actually assembled it. The notion that North Korea has been importing equipment and know-how from around the world, every place they could get it, advanced electronics, these materials, you name it. Some of that they still, I'm convinced they can't make everything, so they still have to import significant quantities of this equipment. The West has looked at this for a very long time, and I anticipate that the intelligence communities have not been remiss in their task of understanding where the money is, understanding where the technology is, and perhaps one of the simplest things might be to insert inferior product. Something that has an intentional flaw in it. Say I give you this glass and it's a container, and without pressure it's going to sit here, it's going to be very fine. A superficial examination might be that it's a perfect glass, but I know it's going to be under pressure when it's actually launched, and I've induced a flaw that's very difficult to tell, and maybe the glass ruptures. Well, that could be a fuel tank, it could be a strut, it could be some electronics that aren't stressed in the actual testing. So perhaps today we'll kill we will occasion the death of a couple of quality assurance engineers in North Korea that haven't been able to find these flaws before. So at one point you have the anti-missile missile, which is after the launch. You also have certainly the United States has the capability, and Japan is mooting the question as to whether they want to obtain the capability of interdicting those missiles before they're launched. But also I would...
which also could be interpreted as an act of war.
Of course.
Interdiction, right?
Yes, of course. The interdiction involves... in this instance, I'm talking about physical interdiction, where you would take a Tomahawk cruise missile and destroy the launch pad.
Right.
This last missile, one of the reasons that it has certainly gotten attention, not just the timing with the vote in the UN Security Council to impose unanimously impose, which is a marked step forward, which is, I understand, is a tremendous step by Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and the Trump administration is relatively unheralded. And what I've seen in the mainstream media, it's almost unheard of that all of the members of the UN Security Council, because you're talking about China and Russia also,
Right.
have voted to impose these sanctions. Now, they weren't the original sanctions that were proposed. They're somewhat watered down for that, but it is remarkable that they did that. So certainly, physically interdicting, having a direct action against the launch pad is an act of war, because you're blowing up something in someone else's territory. What is so potentially destabilizing about the missile that was tested was it is supposedly erected and launched from a mobile platform. It's a gigantic diesel-powered truck that was brought in from China. There were
Pretty cool-looking truck.
It's a pretty cool-looking truck. If it's the one I understand it is, it's actually powered by a Cummins diesel, an 800-horsepower diesel engine from America that was sold into China market for mining equipment, heavy equipment being transported across rugged terrain. So North Korea only has about 780 kilometers of paved roads. So some of the launchers will have a difficult time traversing unpaved roads, unimproved roads in North Korea. Do you think that Tokyo by itself has 24,000 kilometers of paved roads? Just the city of Tokyo is 24,000 kilometers of paved roads. So the notion that you would have a missile of such range that could be on a vehicle that could go overland, overland as in on an unimproved road. Now, the monsoons are pretty nasty in Korea, and many of these roads become almost unpassable. You could not traverse some of these roads in bad weather. They're just simply horrible roads, I'm sure. And this is a massive, very heavy vehicle. But if you think about the ability of the North Koreans to integrate all of those launch capabilities and the control capabilities on such a portable platform, you think about their ability to disaggregate that equipment and to scatter it out. And so if all you need is a concrete pad and you've got the transporter erector, the erector launcher portion of the transporter erector launcher, you've got it in a cave someplace, and all you need is a concrete pad, you can put a lot of concrete pads in Korea with the size of the country. So at once, this is impressive in terms of being able to put this on a mobile platform. It's also very unsettling in terms of being able to distribute the parts that went onto that vehicle and put them into hidden sites bored out of a mountain. You know, for many, many decades, North Korea bought more deep mining equipment than any country on the planet, which is pretty astonishing when you think about it, because they don't export that much in terms of raw materials and ores, even though it is apparently a fairly rich place in terms of undeveloped ore deposits. They were buying that, it was thought mostly for tactical and strategic military purposes. Honeycombing mountains with everything from warehouses to barracks to artillery positions to entire airfields that are underground. So the notion that they couldn't take those elements that they integrated onto this vehicle and put it into in a cubby hole on the side of a mountain just to pull out is pretty far-fetched. I think it's a fairly simple thing to posit that they could do this. Now, who cares? If they're only delivering 500 kilos into downtown Tokyo and it's a conventional weapon, like high explosive, conventional weapon or a chemical weapon, and it lands, a few blocks from here, we wouldn't know about it until it came on the news. You might hear the sirens of the first responders heading that way, and you turn on the TV and see what was happening. The nuclear weapons, of course, change all of that. You'd know it was a nuclear weapon if it landed and worked a few blocks away. You and a lot of other people would know it. It wouldn't mean the end of Tokyo. It wouldn't mean the end of Japanese civilization or their government. But it could possibly leave a large smoking hole in the middle of the densest population.
Well, it would start a war, essentially.
Well,
But I mean,
I'm not going to talk about Maxine Waters. Say that again. It could start a war.
well, it could start a war.
It would be a war. That is by definition a war.
Sure.
But
it doesn't make sense. I mean, all of the launches, they're practicing. They're trying to hone their skills. I mean, like you said earlier, it is remarkable what they've been able to achieve so far. Even, I mean, the sanctions weren't fully in place, but look at what they've been able to do, even with the resources they have at hand.
Well, the sanctions are in place. Bear in mind that the sanctions were in place, not full spectrum economic sanctions, but the sanctions against them acquiring and continuing to develop missile technology were in place, have been in place for a very long time. They weren't supposed to access that the raw materials or the know-how, and they weren't supposed to export it either.
Right.
Now, these last sanctions were not an increase in the missile technology control regime sanctions against North Korea. They are full spectrum economic sanctions. In my understanding, is one of the issues is regarding coal exports. That the Chinese agreed to limit the coal exports. It's one of the few remaining cash cows that the North Korean economy has is selling coal to China. So the Chinese agreed to hold that at the rate of the last 2 or 3 years. Well, the only problem is that they haven't ever disclosed what that rate was. So they could double it or triple it and say, well, we were importing 3x, and actually they were just importing X. So there are some holes in the sanctions, but it's a typical progression of diplomatic sanctions. The question is, what's left? It certainly doesn't hurt the upper end of the regime in North Korea. I can't imagine it does. Right. But it certainly is going to hurt someone on the bottom end, which is unfortunate. But I'm all for hurting them rather than getting hurt myself.
Right. Well, in reaction to all of these offensive capabilities, the United States and the Japanese have cobbled together some sort of a defensive posture, including the Aegis system, THAAD. There's a system called the X-band, which is figuring out where these missiles are coming from right at launch, right?
Yes, the United States employs a system of detection, warning, discrimination, and engagement that's very complex. It starts with launch detection. There is no way to hide the exhaust plume of a large rocket. It leaves a trail of very hot gases strewn across the sky. So there is a system of satellites sitting at 36,000 kilometers over the equator that simply stare at the Earth, and they watch such hot events. And they can, as a side benefit, they can also see volcano eruptions, lava flows. They can track those. Lava tends not to move at 10,000 miles an hour. So they are optimized to actually detect and give an initial estimate of the location and the direction of a rocket launch.
And also they're watching left of launch too.
The left of launch in that instance would be what the Japanese euphemistically call reconnaissance satellites, spy satellites that look in visible light and infrared light, or use radar to penetrate through even cloud cover or darkness in order to see preparations. For example, this last rocket, it was actually launched from Pyongyang's international airport. So if they only have a couple of flights a day, but if you had flown in, you would have seen early morning they rolled this launcher out, this giant truck, and erected a missile that was already put together. They erected this missile, they fueled it up, and then it takes a distinct period of time. And it may well be that some nation or another had a low Earth orbiting satellite that was in position to photograph that and to send that information down for analysis. Nevertheless, even though it might be a secret kept from me as a U.S. taxpayer, or you, as we pay Japanese taxes, the Japanese information gathering satellites and the U.S. information gathering satellites, spy satellites as they might be called, the North Koreans and many other people actually know the orbits of most of these satellites. So they would actually time that between those movements to see if they could successfully obscure their own preparations from that eye in the sky.
Right. Have everybody playing volleyball. That sort of thing.
Right. But you cannot hide the plume, the launch plume, which is the hot gases. So yes, but left of launch before the actual launch, there might be a window where you could have that. So this is why countries spend a lot of time trying not to disclose the orbits and the timetables under which their satellite or the capabilities of those satellites. Yet the very nature of them is they're pretty large and they're in low Earth orbit, and there are amateur astronomers who usually spot these things within 24 to 72 hours. They start and they pass the information around the world, and they believe that there's a new orbiting body around the Earth, and it coincides with the launch that just happened the week before, or the day before, from the Japanese that launched their latest spy satellite. So you can rest assured that the North Koreans are aware of those timetables and are trying to work between them.
Well, I mean, even with that, I mean, it is a complete system. It's a huge package of getting it in low orbit, getting it in high orbit. The last time they shot a rocket between Hokkaido and Honshu, I mean, it was way above the stratosphere. Nothing we have would have hit it anyway.
Correct. So the United States has a very complex system of systems. Those systems do the launch detection. They look at the launch sites for preparation. They look at the launch sites. They look at the launch event. The X-band ground-based radar that you mentioned is a U.S. owned and operated radar in northern Honshu near the Sea of Japan. It's focused on North Korea for these exact purposes. So they get an early warning, and then they'll focus the energy down very, very finely to watch and to detect and track that missile. Without that warning, it's difficult for them to focus the energy correctly to see that missile because it just doesn't reflect well. It's from a side profile. It's a round device. It's not reflecting a whole lot of energy. So they need to focus that energy down very, very finely to get the best discrimination. They continue to track it. So the United States has multiple opportunities to detect, track, analyze the trajectory, make sure everything is working, and then to send something up to engage it. And depending on the altitude and the speed of the actual missile, there are certain systems that can engage, others that cannot engage. The Japanese only have a couple of pieces of that entire spectrum that the United States has. Now, they certainly exchange information with the United States. The United States will provide information. The Japanese are building new systems. They want to build their own space-based infrared sensing system to where they would have their own early warning so they can cue their radars. They have their own radars called Gamera. One of the Japanese electronics firms built this giant radar.
That's a good name.
Yeah, well, it's named for that because it has a giant dome on the back. It looks like the back of Gamera, the mutant giant turtle shell, and I think some child named it that or whatever. But anyway, so they don't have that early warning from the infrared system, so they depend upon that in the United States, and apparently the United States gave them that warning immediately. It's now part of the integration of these systems. Certainly the Maritime Self-Defense Force and the U.S. 7th Fleet have a very close operational relationship, and between them, with a number of Aegis ships, they could have the Aegis ships in place, watching the missile. But the Aegis anti-missile is called the SM-3 Block 1, only works outside the atmosphere. It doesn't work inside the atmosphere. It can't see anything inside the atmosphere. It leaves the atmosphere, and then it actually dumps off the nose cone, so it uncovers a sensor that can actually see the target. Until then, it can't see anything. So it has to engage another missile outside the atmosphere. The THAAD is an endo-atmospheric, it's not exo-atmospheric. Endo-atmospheric, it works long range within the upper stretches of the atmosphere. The final defense that we depend upon in Tokyo is the Patriot missiles. I believe it's a Patriot PAC-3 that would be
as they're coming in.
As they're coming in, as whatever's left of the missile, whether it's just a warhead or the entire single-stage rocket coming back into the atmosphere. But it only has a slant range, I've read in unclassified media, slant range of about 20 kilometers. So it has to know well in advance that there's something coming.
Right. So like a last ditch, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very much a last ditch.
And these are much larger rockets than what's on the Aegis.
The Patriot?
Yes.
All things being equal, fast rockets are big rockets. The next generation Aegis rocket being co-developed between the United States and Japan is called the SM-3 Block 2A. It's a 21-inch missile all the way down. Right now it's only a 13.5-inch missile, but the largest missile that will fit inside the honeycomb, the firing cells inside an Aegis ship, is a 21-inch missile. So it has more propellant, it can go faster, it can reach a target farther away, it can intercept a target that's moving faster. The Patriot PAC-3 missiles are not huge, and that's one of the reasons the range is fairly limited, but it's also endo-atmospheric. It's only useful inside the atmosphere because the missile itself is initially controlled by fins and it's controlled by some propulsion units on the side of the missile that steer it back in. THAAD does the same thing at a longer range. All of this, once beyond the very basic outlines, gets complicated and classified. But you imagine that the Japanese have certain pieces of it. But they don't have the same problem the United States has. In order for an ICBM to reach Seattle, Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C., it has to go at a tremendously high speed, which means it's a different problem. And you need a different solution for that.
Right. Well, apparently the main target of their affection right now is Guam, perhaps Okinawa.
Well, the last missiles are intermediate range missiles. They don't have the range yet. They have not demonstrated the range for a missile to reach the American homeland, the lower 48. And that was the point, I believe, the clear technical point of this last launch was they launched it in a direction that would only aggravate the Japanese. Let's put it that way.
Maybe the Russians.
It wasn't a very neighborly thing. No, the Russians weren't upset about this.
Apparently not, but it landed closer to Russian territory than it did to the Japanese territory.
Oh, it landed due east of the southernmost tip of Hokkaido, which was kind of threading the gap between the large population centers in Sapporo and Aomori. If you were in Hakodate, about 280,000 people, you wouldn't be happy. But this is literally beyond the ability of a human to understand. If they had not been told by the government this was happening, they would never know. So the missile probably went higher than the regular orbit of the International Space Station. Not just a little bit, but like 100 to 200 kilometers higher than the orbit of the International Space Station. That's a long ways up. And no one in Japan would know anything about it. And there's one aspect of this that is often misunderstood. And people say, we should have shot it down. Why didn't we shoot it down? Well, it's not flying, for one thing. It's actually going on a ballistic trajectory, just as if you threw a rock or I use the analogy, a water balloon. If I throw a water balloon at you and I loft it at you, and the balloon burst in mid-arc, the water's still going your way. So it's not like an aircraft. It's not in the atmosphere. If I take a wing off an aircraft, or if I take out the engines, or the aircraft fuselage is blown in half,
it'll go down.
It will stop its forward motion and it'll drop almost vertically. If you intercept a missile in flight, one of these devices flying outside the atmosphere, it's going to continue flying in the same direction. It's just not going to work. It's going to be in pieces, and still you'll get all of whatever it was. If it was chemical weapons, they'll burn up on re-entry in the atmosphere. If it's high explosives, they would not go high order. They would burn, but they would not explode. If it's a nuclear weapon, you're still going to have the fissile material scattered around, but it's a much smaller problem than if it goes off.
Right. Similarly, if it's a two-stage rocket, that first stage that is dropped off, it's going to follow that trajectory too. So this nonsense about, if you're in the field when the rocket is flying over, cover your head. I mean, there's not going to be any debris there, right?
Typically, the first stage of a two-stage rocket falls off. It completes its burn. The main engine cuts off, and it's usually precisely timed to cut off. And then it separates by explosive bolts and devices that separate it. And there's still enough. It's still low enough in the atmosphere for its forward progression to stop very quickly. So it will, in fact, fall to Earth.
So
and in the event of Japan,
apogee.
it's going to fall in the Sea of Japan. It's not going to fall on Japan. It can't. the first stage probably can't even if they try, they couldn't put the first stage to fall on Japan. It's going to fall in the Sea of Japan. In fact, my anticipation is that some of these first stages that the North Koreans have used for these tests have been recovered by the United States and Japan. The North Koreans, I doubt if they have the technology to recover them from the seabed. And in fact, there are reports that once they realized that the United States and Japan were actually using commercial ships to go down and recover these first stages so they could analyze all of it. Where did they get the materials? What electronics are they using? How have they avoided the sanctions all these decades? My understanding is that the North Koreans started placing explosives in them and blowing them up after they've done their job. It might be the second stage that you're thinking about. It will not go into orbit. It's not going fast enough to go into orbit. It's not going 17,000 kilometers an hour, but it's going quite fast. So it will fall back to Earth someplace later. It might stay in space for a period of time, but will eventually decay, come back into Earth. Much of it will burn up. Typically what's left is really heavy, like titanium structures. I mean, if it falls in your apartment, it would ruin your day, but not going to bother anybody in the building next door. It's not going to blow up or anything. It's just an inert chunk of metal.
Well, that's really enlightening. Thank you very much, Lance. Is there anything else that you want to talk about, tell our viewers that you're doing, that you're involved in? I've been watching you on TV these last 2 weeks. You've really been on fire, and I appreciate you being on the show.
Well, I've actually spent a lot of time over the years explaining these technologies to laymen, to journalists, to academics and folks, and I think it's very important that people understand that it's not the end of the world, but the threat is substantial. It's meant to be substantial. I don't have a real good track record of looking at things from the view of other people. I look at the technology of it, and I think it's very important that voters, taxpayers, and policymakers understand the limitations of these technologies, understand the effort that it's taken to get here, and understand that there's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of doubt on everyone's side. Will my offensive system work? Will my defensive system work? If they fail, what's the outcome? And some of these things we really don't want to know. So it's well worth the time to have a diplomatic solution, but my concern is that some people are heading towards a more kinetic solution. Right.
Listen, I hope you don't mind me giving you a shameless plug, but you've been in Japan for more than 30 years. You're a West Point graduate. You've been involved in defense and aerospace ever since I've known you, and we've known each other for a long time. I also understand that you're a judoist. You've been teaching for a long time, and you're working on a book that describes this generation of self-defense and how it was initiated here in Japan.
Well, thank you. I do appreciate your interest in this.
Sure.
I run the U.S. Embassy Judo Dojo. We celebrated our 61st year this year. It's one of the oldest in Tokyo. We have records going back to 1904 that American women in the embassy were taking judo. Some of the earliest records of women taking judo. We now have people that are third and fourth generation. I've been working on a book for probably 15 years when I realized that the histories, the written histories of Japanese martial arts are incorrect. There was a lot of intentional obfuscation of the history during the occupation. So it became kind of an obsession of mine. And I hope to have the book out before the Olympics so people that come to Japan and people that can enjoy the martial arts around the world realize that the reality is much more complex and pretty surprising, and is not at all what they think.
All right. Thank you very much, Lance. What an interesting and enlightening conversation we've just had. Please stay tuned to Tokyo on Fire. We're going to continue to delve into what's going on with North Korea and what you can expect. Stay tuned.